But okay, yeah. So I'd probably do something like this, and do you want to maybe we'll move on to talking about tweets and that side of things
Yeah,
now?
yeah, yeah. Yeah, continue.
Okay,
Yeah.
cool. So we have something like a tweet, and then the tweet we'd have an ID as well. And this is something quite interesting, I guess, is you might do a UUID here as well. But part of a consideration I have is whether we want to use something more specific than a UUID that gives us more information on sharding. So what I mean by that is a UUID is random, right? Like the idea of it is, obviously you can have like UUIDs that are prefixed and, that work by time or whatever. But if we assume that we're talking about UUID v4, it's just a random, supposedly never replicable type of ID. But there is also the possibility of needing something which can be more identifying of where the tweet comes from. So I guess almost like when you have like an aluminium can produced at a factory, is it might have a little serial number at the bottom, or it might be printed with a certain thing to say it came from stamp line 29 or something like that. And that's something that I guess it's something that we might want to keep in mind as well. So, for example, Instagram does something similar where they actually take the current timestamp, and then after that they put the this is an article I read a long time ago, so it might be out of date, but they put the timestamp, and after that they put the shard ID, which is like a separate few bits as well, and then after that they put they put an incrementer. So basically, the number of tweets within that second on that particular shard is like I think they can support like 1024 on that particular shard, if that makes sense. So I'm just wondering, is that something that we need to keep in mind as well? And that's part of my consideration. But at this stage, I think maybe we can just stick with a UID. But that sharding might be beneficial for stuff like, if we need to do error handling, or if we need to consider.
Is there a pro and con of the two solutions?
I think
Like,
the main con is that it's more work to actually build up that ID properly. Um, and the other con is that you're probably storing more data. Generally speaking, you'd probably end up with something larger than a UID. Not necessarily, but probably. Just because you're trying to store more information in there. In terms of the pros, I think we're talking about like, okay, well, if we're seeing a lot of tweets from particular shards that work and other ones that fail, or if this particular tweet is causing problems, we can kind of backtrace that and see why that is the case, and then that kind of helps with server-side debugging and that kind of stuff as well. Whereas if you have like a generic error message that says this particular tweet is not sending properly, and then if it just has a UID, working back up that chain can potentially be difficult. So that's mainly my consideration there.
yeah, okay, cool. Let's go to hashtags so we can wrap.
All right. Yeah, I'll keep this quick. So basically text, you probably have some sort of text in there. And this one, yeah, so I mean, this relationship, you might do something, you most certainly would do something like, yeah. You most certainly would do something like this as well over here, but we can't be bothered for the sake of time. We'll speed it up a
Yeah,
bit. Yeah.
and maybe we'll talk about edges. So how exactly is an edge represented in, a graph here?
So essentially, you can traverse along from nodes to different nodes via the edges. So you can say like, okay, well, from a particular node, we can say, look at all of the nodes connected to it that have a certain edge between them. So for example, if you're on a particular user, you can say, find all the users connected to this user via this type of user relationship, and you can query that. So if you want to find all the tweets by a user, it would be a similar thing to say, look for all of them with a user like with a certain tweeting relationship. Look for all the tweets associated with a particular user.
Okay. Yeah, I get it.
Cool.
Makes sense.
This one might not actually be many because you can only reference a tweet, like a single tweet. So this might actually just be like that, I think, because multiple tweets can retweet the same tweet, but they can only retweet the same single tweet in that tweet, if that makes any sense. But anyways, yeah, so you can represent this, or you can we'll just leave it be. We can work more on that, but we're going to talk about hashtags. Duplicate. Okay, that works. And we can grab this one here. So for hashtags in particular, I think um, once again, I'll just keep it simple with UUID. I don't think we want to use the actual hashtag as an identifier. You can make the argument that the hashtag probably won't change, which then might make people think, why not just use the hashtag as an ID? I find that in general system design, that's usually a bit of a trap in my experience, is that you take something that you think is going to be forever unique, and then down the line, it's no longer unique. Like hashtags need to be renamed because one of them contains a term that is now politically insensitive and you want to go back and change tweets, but you don't want to like remove the actual link itself. Then all of a sudden, the text becomes something that can be mutable. So I'd actually, I think a naive system design would say, use the hashtag because it's unique, obviously, but I'd say probably still have an ID, and you can enforce uniqueness on the hashtag in other ways. But I'd have a separate ID for that, and then you'd have some sort of like text or tag name or whatever for the hashtag as well. And that would probably be there, and you probably have a hashtag and tweet relationship kind of similar to this one, and quite similar to this as well. Does that all make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. So we'll pause the role play there. So just the comments. So I think the identification with the enumerable IDs is a good positive. I guess it's somewhat basic, but you explained it well. Like you can guess people's user IDs if you have one. If it follows a certain pattern. What you said about hashtag is true. The common pitfall of using some of its data to identify itself, whereas the example you gave with political correctness stuff, etc. Good example. I think with the tweet, you talked about like extending the ID to contain a bit more information. I think you could have kind of probed about security, because that when someone sees the tweet, they know which shard is coming from. That is a both pro and a con, right? It's easy for debugging, but it's a con in a sense that it's giving out more information.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah. So in general, I think front end, back end, whatever, you always want to think of security and how you can plug it. You want to plug security somewhere in there. You want to demonstrate that you think about these things in your design. And often people's solution does have security, like considerations in them, either inherited from just like what they know, but you want to show that you're conscious of it. Yes, which you did, right? I'm just saying, yeah. So that's just kind of a tip, I guess. Like, because people can be like, oh, user, let's just, and then when asked why, they're like, I don't know. It's easy to generate. Yeah. Which is a valid reason, right? It's like it's easy to generate, but like you're kind of missing the bigger picture, right? And we want to hear some of those things. So yeah, that's good. We tested on requirements, adaptation to requirements, and how you react to being poked to changing a design. You mentioned a bit of security. So yeah, I think in general it's quite well done. Like, interviews are never smooth, right? Like the purpose of it is to have a bit of pressure and stuff.
Yeah.
To like it's not like you're here and you're just making a cake or watching a cake bake. We want to see the candidate be put under a little bit of pressure, and how they respond. In general, I think it's really good. I wouldn't say there's anything wrong with it. Obviously, I think like we're both mainly front end engineers. So I can tell that we don't know that much about this sort of stuff. But generally it's fine, barring the in-depth knowledge aside.
What I personally feel like in terms of this interview, and I'll try my best to keep this relatively raw as well on YouTube, kind of showing some of my pitfalls as well, is that one thing I think is around the actual like day-to-day modeling of a lot of this stuff, and what you do as, like, for example, a software architect or as a backend principal, like if that is your job to design a system like this, how you represent that information and the actual standards that you follow, I think are very important, right? It's like if someone tried to do front end dev and they were building some front end architecture, which we could do in a later session, for example, but then they come over and they don't know JSON and they're trying to write everything as XML, then we can be like, like it's fine because we're modeling, but that's not how you do things. So I think one thing for me personally, I feel is that understanding more of how you'd approach specific backend standards to modeling, I think is valuable.
Yeah. Well, I think the actual like the diagram specifically for like design is very important because you have to document, like you have to document it somehow. Like it's not even a choice, right? Like often, you need to document your system design, like and maybe your sequence diagrams when you start making APIs and actual like journeys, user journeys. So it's kind of a skill that I would expect from maybe not even principal, but even like just senior, because even seniors make a lot of decisions, right? And like I'm still somewhat confused about the edge. Like, yes, in terms of like how it works on a graph like schema, but it still has to be stored somewhere, right? And how it's stored, it depends on, what DB you're using.
Yeah, like
So
so something like this, from the perspective of a database, I think it's a very kind of graph database unique solution. So, in a relational database, that's the thing is you don't really have the concept of an edge as like for example, you have a users table, and then you have to have a separate table for user relationships, and then that would have leader user ID, follower user ID, and other metadata. Whereas in a graph, you kind of have that a lot more in a lot more of a straightforward design where you just have two users and you can just create a relationship between them. So in a graph database, anything can have a relationship with anything, as long as you define it properly. Then you can manage that and query that quite well.
maybe it's yeah, okay, fair enough. Like maybe it's a specific database because I always thought like graph is more of a schema. It's agnostic to the actual database. Like you can implement graph in Postgres or whatever if you want.
Yep. So I think like there are graph databases that are more. My understanding of this is incomplete as well, but it's like some databases are more optimized to store these types of relations, and
Yeah, I
there are
think
many kind of RDBMS, like relational solutions that can also be optimized to store graph type data. So my understanding is that even in Facebook's case, I think before they did transition to a very graph type model. And I think they have a proprietary database to handle that. But even before that point, they were using a graph style model in GraphQL and that sort of stuff, but handling that with a database that was relational. Is my
yeah,
understanding of that.
yeah, it's my understanding as well. Yeah, okay, it makes sense. Yeah, so it looks like so I think it's just some of these newer databases have specific like specific thing like you can actually make an edge. Okay, that makes sense. Um, okay, cool.
And I think
Yeah,
that that's quite interesting as well. Like you kind of raise an interesting point, right? Is that at this point it's almost like I said this thing, but I could say build this in MySQL, or if that was already what we had, and we had another business case that means we have to use a particular database. If that were the case, then this data structure can also be represented there. It might not be as efficient or as performant or whatever, but it's important to differentiate between the data and the way you store your data, right? So if you have the data model defined properly, there is actually always more than one way to store it, and that is more around your performance considerations, your business cost considerations, etc., as opposed to a consideration necessarily like, okay, we have this type of data, we have to use this particular database. If that makes any sense.
yeah, I think so too. Yes. Um, yeah, there's not much else I want to say. I think yeah, pretty good, I guess.
Cool.
Like I think the point of this session in hindsight is like you can see the perspectives of both ends, right? Like if we just did an interview and we didn't pause the role playing, then I wouldn't have the opportunity to explain why I asked certain things and what I was trying to probe into and what I was trying to get at. in reverse, people can see as the candidate, how do you like respond, and your perspective. It's always kind of hard, right? Like to stay in sync. Yeah. So people can rock into an interview thinking they've done really well, but could be the very opposite, right? The interviewer might think they just talked about their own stuff and actually answered nothing that I was asking, which happens quite often. Like sometimes you ask a basic question, is like, what are the security concerns of using 123 as an ID? And then they go on like a massive tangent, right? They go all the way and they name, they start talking about AWS or something. And there's like, they might feel like they talked about a lot of, or they demonstrated a lot of knowledge, but they kind of missed the point of the question, right? Like, I just wanted a simple answer, is people can guess, people can enumerate the IDs. Don't need to talk about AWS. Yeah. So, yeah. So, yeah, that's about it. I mean, without saying too much else, the most important thing is to keep communication on the same page.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I guess like
I
I'm
think,
interested to understand as well, like there are things I feel like I could have improved upon, but from your perspective as an interviewer, what would you say that I could have done better in terms of being,
yeah,
like
yeah.
from your perspective?
Yeah, I think generally you did a good job. But the main thing is maybe to eat your own words, is like play it like golf. Maybe don't say too much.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like often what I see is you're designing ahead. I mean, it's not so good because we're using Twitter as an example. So in your brain, you already know what Twitter is, right? But there are a lot of assumptions that kind of waste our time in a sense, right? Like I don't get anything out of it as an interviewer. For example, the part about tweets doing many to many or one to many references to themselves doesn't matter. It's a business rule, right? Like that's not what I'm here for, or what I'm trying to look at, right? Yeah. So I think give a little bit of space for the interviewer to lead a little bit, so they kind of like direct you to answering stuff on their checklist. Because at the end of the day, probably they would have like a checklist, right? Like there are certain things that they're looking for. They're not going to hit all of them. Usually the list is too long to fit in a 1.5 hour session. Um, but they'll try and like keep pushing you to like meet those points. Yeah. So you need to be aware of that, and not spend too long on one point, so you can take more in the time span. Yeah.
Very
Yeah.
valuable.
So yeah. So just stick to the point, and you can always like stop maybe halfway and be like, is that enough? Do you want more information? Like that's better than spending another 5 minutes to flesh out some details that doesn't matter. And as the interviewer, it kind of feels bad to like stop them and try and progress.
Yeah, I think like for me as when I'm an interviewer, I tend to just jump in more. So I was more expecting like, like kind of you to just say, well, okay, that's fine. Let's move on as well. But yeah,
Mm.
I was like, when
Yeah,
is enough? And I think like finding that balance, I think is an important skill as well. Sure.
yeah. I think there's no hard rules for that. Like, yeah, like some people might be like you, they keep the person on track. Um, for me, is like I tend to let them, set the pace a little bit. Because I want to see, yeah, like I want to listen more than I speak is the thing I try to do. So that's the reason for me anyway.
Cool.
Yeah. And like you could also, go for an interview and the dude can be a complete ass and like literally be looking for a certain solution. So maybe like we talk about this, right? And then the guy is like a huge Mongo fan and you talk about like Graph and Postgres or whatever, and basically he just wrote you off already. And like that is completely possible. I wouldn't say that that's the right attitude to interview someone. Um, but sometimes, just get a bad session. It's not your fault.
Cool. All right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we can wrap it up there unless there's anything else you wanted to
No,
mention
no, I
into
think
your.
it's good. Yeah, I think like if we do a front end one, it'll be obviously a lot more interesting and easier because that's where my skills are. But yeah.
Well, thank you everyone for listening. I hope you have enjoyed the session. I will try my best. I think maybe we can upload this one as an entire clip because I think a lot of it is just really quite quite a lot of information
Yeah.
jam packed, which is pretty
Yeah,
good.
it is. It's yeah. Normally these sessions should be 1.5 to 2 hours. I really doubt you can assess someone properly in like an hour. Usually an hour is the coding one, and like the whiteboarding ones are a bit longer. So I wouldn't say we're technically over time because we only did 1.5 hours.
Yeah, and also we spent a lot of time explaining, so we only really covered like maybe about an hour of stuff
Yeah, yeah,
at bigger pace. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Cool,
Well,
cool.
leave your comments below if you want to see some more stuff like this. If you want to see me interview Patrick as well and put him under the spotlight, or if you want to see anything
Let's
else,
go for it.
just let us know. And any questions, criticisms, leave them below, and be happy to hear them. And that is pretty much it. Well, thank you very much for listening. This has been Lucas from Better Coding Academy, and see you guys later. Bye bye.
Bye bye.
And I think that is a wrap.